You should eat in the bathroom that suits you best. I was furious at Emma, my daughter-in-law, and even more so at my son Bob. I couldn't forgive them for neglecting my dear father. They better be prepared. What happened? The usual stuff, but this time I couldn't overlook Bob and Emma's behavior any longer. I decided to fight back. My name is Catherine, and I'm 60 years old. My family includes my 80-year-old father and my 40-year-old son, Bob. Originally, Bob lived with my husband and me, but after my mother's passing, my father was left alone. We decided Bob should move in with him, which was comforting since that house was where I spent my childhood. However, the distance between my current home and my father's made frequent visits challenging. I was grateful when my son volunteered to move in with him. I'm worried about Grandpa, and I wanted to try living somewhere else, Bob said. He had never moved out before, even commuting to college from home, and probably longed for independence. Thank you, please take care of Grandpa. I entrusted my father to my son. At that time, Bob was 40 and still single. I hoped he would find someone special soon, and that wish came true. 6 months after Bob started living with my father, he called me. What's the matter? I'm getting married, he announced, catching me completely off guard. There had been no sign of a girlfriend, so this sudden marriage was a surprise. When did you start seeing someone? I met her through a friend soon after I started living with Grandpa. She's a really nice person, Bob reassured me, and I felt relieved. Then came the day of the family meeting. My husband James and I participated. Nice to meet you, I greeted Emma, who was to be my son's wife. Hello, I'm Bob's father, my husband followed. Emma was tall, slender, and blonde, with sharp eyes. She was beautiful, but her behavior quickly changed my impression of her. This is your mom and dad. Emma looked us up and down condescendingly. Being scrutinized by someone you just met is uncomfortable. Is something wrong? I asked Emma. You don't look anything like your mom, she replied. Me? Mom? Indeed, my son and I don't resemble each other. He probably takes after his father more. I was aware of this, but never expected to hear it from Emma, whom I had just met. Where's your grandpa? She continued. He lives here. What? I thought it was just the two of us. Emma seemed unaware that my father and son were living together. I assumed it was common knowledge. Come on, she suddenly complained, acting childishly. Emma was the same age as my son but didn't seem her age at all. I thought I'd be living with you alone, Bob, she pouted. My son looked disturbed by her behavior, and my husband was also visibly surprised by Emma's outburst. But Bob must have chosen her for a reason. Even as she threw a tantrum, my son looked at her kindly and calmed her down. It's okay, I'll take care of Grandpa. Really? I won't give you that burden, Emma replied. If that's the case, I'm fine with that. Emma seemed convinced by my son's words. However, I couldn't forget her earlier behavior. Was she ignoring us, or did she simply not see us? Either way, it seemed like she only had eyes for my son. In a way, it was sweet, but as her future mother-in-law, I was full of worries. Could I get along with her? Our first impression was so overwhelming that I found myself disliking Emma despite just having met her. My husband later admitted he felt the same way. Will everything be okay? I asked, worried. The problem wasn't just with Emma. I was also concerned about her living with my father. Clearly, she was reluctant to live with him. Despite my son's willingness to care for my father, I feared Emma might be cold towards him. Even during the family meeting, she barely spoke to me and seemed distant. The same with my husband. I'm not just worried about myself, but mostly about my father. I usually don't visit often, but now I know I should check in regularly. I made a promise to myself to do that. There was no news from my son and Emma for a month after their marriage. I thought my son would contact me if there were any problems. But so far, there's been no word. I assumed this meant things were going well. So I decided to leave them be. Above all, I wanted to avoid any interaction with Emma. Then one day, Bob and Emma suddenly returned home. Emma looked visibly upset. What happened? I asked. I just don't get your dad, Emma snapped. She was angry at my father, saying he had stormed into her room after 2 o'clock a.m. because she had been on the phone loudly with friends until late at night. That's when most people are asleep, so I couldn't help but sympathize with my father. I told you I didn't want to deal with David, didn't I? Emma was angry, not with my son, but with me. I couldn't understand why she was angry at me. It was my son who decided to live with his grandfather, not at my command. Emma was lashing out, and I was at a loss. I wanted to live quietly with Bob, so why did things have to be this way? Her last comment struck me deeply. That's because you don't even care to look after your own parent. After venting her frustration, Emma seemed satisfied and left. Are you okay? My husband, who had witnessed the entire exchange, asked with concern. She's a difficult person, isn't she? If you have any problems, just let me know, he reassured me kindly. Thank you. In my nearly 60 years, this was the first time someone younger than me had blamed me so harshly. Of course, I would apologize for mistakes at work, but Emma's accusations were blatantly unreasonable. This wasn't how a daughter-in-law should treat her mother-in-law. I knew I should care for my father as his daughter, but he wanted to remain in a house filled with memories of my mother and me. He was still capable of taking care of himself, and moving him forcibly didn't seem right. This decision was made after much thought, and Bob agreed to live with him. I didn't think Emma had any right to interfere. This incident made me even less inclined to interact with her, though avoiding her proved difficult. One day, Emma showed up at my house alone, without Bob. It was the first time she had visited by herself, and her refusal to even address me by name irritated me further. I wondered if Emma lacked basic manners. What's going on? I asked, reluctantly stepping outside. Emma looked at me with distaste. Oh, you are here, she said, as if annoyed. Then she started yelling at me. This is all your fault. My fault. Yes, I married Bob thinking we would live together. So why do I have to live with David too? She was still holding a grudge about my father. I asked Emma, isn't Bob taking care of my father? He doesn't look after him at all and leaves everything to me. It's ruining our married life, she retorted. She glared at me. It's all because of you. With that, she left without waiting for a response. I wanted to explain to Emma that my father wanted to stay in his house, but it seemed pointless. Emma wasn't willing to listen, and anything I said would be met with resistance. The situation made me want to avoid Emma even more. But I was concerned about my son not caring for my father. Worried, I decided to visit my father's home after a long time. Even though he could take care of himself, I wanted to see if Bob was really looking after him. 2 years after Bob and Emma got married, they had a child, my grandchild. I decided to visit for Christmas, excited to meet my first grandchild. But now, it seemed like my father was being put on the back burner. I couldn't forgive Emma for treating my father like a nuisance. Finally, the day came for my visit. It had been 6 months since my last one. I'm home, I said. Emma greeted me with an unmistakably displeased expression. I was used to her attitude by now. It probably wouldn't change. I went straight to my father's room only to find it had been converted into a nursery. Had they given up his room for the grandchild? Stepping outside, I saw my father in the garden. What are you doing out here? I asked. Why was he sleeping outside in the cold? Emma then brought some food. Here's today's portion. Eat in the bathroom, as usual. I was shocked by her words. Why was my father eating in the bathroom? It's the usual thing, my father answered. Emma was treating him terribly. He had to eat in the bathroom and sleep outside. It was as if he wasn't even considered a person. I was also angry at my son for not speaking up. If this was the usual treatment, it meant my son was also failing him. This was unforgivable. I decided to confront both my son and Emma. I tried to persuade my father to move in with us, but he shook his head. This house has memories, he said. I expected this but insisted he should come live with us. It's not good to stay here anymore. Come live with us. I will never make you feel this way again, I said. It took time, but eventually my father agreed. I felt sorry for him, but it was the only way to retaliate against my son and his wife. So my father moved in with us. My husband gladly accepted him. I hoped David could understand our decision. I was deeply grateful for my husband's kindness. When I told my son and Emma about my father moving in with us, they responded with indifference. Is that so? They said. Emma seemed relieved. Just imagining her face made me angry. This was the start of my real retaliation. One day, after returning from a visit to Emma's parents' house, my son found his house had been demolished. What's going on? He asked, confused. The house where he had been living was now a vacant lot. I called him to our house. Why are you calling me out of the blue? He asked angrily. I needed to explain the situation. Hearing my story, he became even angrier. Why did you demolish the house without telling us? Well, you don't mean Dad, right? What does Grandpa have to do with this? I replied firmly. I don't want you and your wife taking over the house filled with memories. You're neglecting Dad, aren't you? I asked my son. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was a hassle to deal with visitors at a time like this. I coldly said to Emma, I didn't think I needed to be kind to someone who treated my dear father terribly. Bob's nowhere to be seen, and suddenly the house is demolished. What's going on? Mom did it, my son said to Emma. What? You did it? Emma still didn't address me by name. It seemed she never really saw me as her mother-in-law. Yes, I did it, I admitted frankly. I didn't think I had done anything wrong. My father and I had been harassed. Why would you do this? Our house is gone. Emma was angry. Explaining why I demolished the house seemed troublesome, but I did it because it was the house where I spent my childhood. My father never wanted to leave it. David's opinion didn't matter. Emma's reply made it clear she only thought about herself. I couldn't afford to lose this battle, but Emma, who married Bob, was incredibly difficult. She never called me by name and constantly harassed me. When I demolished the house, Emma finally showed respect as her mother-in-law in a moment of trouble. You finally called me Catherine, I said, unable to stop smiling. My son's face was strained. Emma, trembling, offered, I'll do anything if you drop the lawsuit. Then promise you'll never come near this house again, I demanded. Not just to my father and me, but preferably not to our grandchild either. I wouldn't want a child raised by someone like you. Emma apologized. I don't want to be separated from my child. I understood her maternal instinct, but I had no sympathy left for her. Ignoring her pleas, I continued, What you're feeling now is the pain I've been carrying all this time. Emma looked startled, perhaps finally realizing the weight of her actions. Turning to Bob, I asked, Do you still intend to stay married to someone like this? I looked at my son, who had been silent. Could he really be okay living with someone as unpleasant as Emma? Bob, you've been part of the harassment towards Dad, just like Emma. No, that's not it. Bob suddenly protested. I was always being ordered around. Ordered around by whom? I asked. Emma told me to feed Grandpa in the toilet and to keep him out of the house as much as possible, Bob confessed. I glared at Emma. She had threatened to take all his money if he didn't obey her. How could you? Emma objected. I sighed deeply, exasperated with Emma. Did she not love my son at all? Was she trying to separate him from his father? Of course I don't love him, Emma admitted. I married Bob because he was single until 40 and had a lot of money. I didn't need Bob, just his money. You married my son for that reason? I asked in disbelief. Yes, that's right, she confirmed. I was furious. I had never shouted so loudly before. Emma's unreasonable actions and threats towards my family were unacceptable. I could no longer consider her a human being. For the sake of my family's well-being, I had to take a stand. It's unfortunate, but goodbye, I said. I placed Emma's belongings outside and led her to the front door. Don't ever come near my precious family again. Emma's protests and knocking went ignored until she finally gave up and left. My son, stunned, didn't chase after her. It was natural for him to want to escape from the threats. I felt a wave of relief. I hadn't felt this good in a long time. Since Emma came into our lives, I had been constantly stressed and worn down. After all the harassment I endured, I believed I had managed to retaliate well against her. Peace finally returned to our home. My son divorced Emma without issue. Although Emma was initially reluctant, my son had no intention of reconciling given the daily threats he faced. The grandchild born to them would be cared for by my son, which I believed was the right decision. If my son had stayed married to Emma, my father would have suffered even more, and Bob might have faced more harassment. I was sorry for everything, but I couldn't easily forgive my son. He had failed in his responsibility to care for my father and should have consulted me if there were any problems, rather than simply obeying Emma's orders. It seemed unlikely we could live together again. I wanted my son to be independent and not return home. Living at home until 40 may have made him too dependent. I hoped he would learn to live on his own and fulfill his responsibilities as a parent. I understand, he said, taking his child and leaving our house. This was for the best. My father quickly settled into our home and seemed more at peace than he had been at the old house. Seeing him adjust so well made me very happy. Being with family truly makes any house a home. I felt deeply relieved that we could live together peacefully, and I hoped our family would continue to thrive harmoniously.